In 11 years, I had never brought a project in over budget. That's not pride. It's the one number I reconcile every Friday to the dollar because it's the number people trust me on. So when my director sat me down on my mid-year review and told me, gently, that my migration project had run $180,000 over, and that it was why the program lead role was going to someone else, the first thing I felt wasn't shame. It was confusion, because the Friday before close, my tracker had said the project was on budget, with room to spare. 2 numbers for one project. One of them was wrong, and I already knew which one I trusted. I asked for the line item detail. He said finance would send it. 11 days later, the gap wasn't spread across my work at all. It was 4 charges I had never seen, on purchase orders I had never raised. So I opened the approval chain, and it didn't end with me. Let me back up, because none of that makes sense without the 11 years that came before it. I'd built my career on being the person who didn't need to be checked. Program leads who ran over budget got put on notice or quietly reassigned. I got the hard projects, the ones with real exposure, because I closed them clean. My Friday ritual was simple. Pull the ledger, reconcile it against my own tracker line by line, flag anything within an hour of noticing it. I'd done it every week for 6 years, including the week before this one. Greg Mercer had been my director for 4 of those years, and I trusted him the way you trust someone who has never once given you a reason not to. He was careful, a little tired-looking, the kind of manager who remembered your kid's name and covered for you in meetings you'd missed. 2 years earlier, when a vendor blew a deadline that wasn't my fault, he'd stood up in front of the VP and taken the delay onto himself rather than let it land on my project record. I'd never forgotten that. It was the kind of thing that makes you stop double-checking a person. When the program lead role opened up that spring, he was the one who told me to apply, and I believed he meant it. He'd said, more than once, that my numbers were the reason the department could promise anything to the executive team with a straight face. The migration project, moving 3 legacy systems onto one platform, 11 months, a 7-figure budget, was supposed to be the thing that made the promotion obvious. I told my husband as much that spring, half joking, that if I brought this one in clean, there'd be no reason left for them to say no. It wasn't just a title I wanted. It was the thing that made 11 years of being careful finally add up to something. 3 weeks before close, I froze all new spend against it, the way I always do at that stage. Nothing goes on the books that isn't already committed. I signed to freeze myself and sent the confirmation to finance. The review itself happened in his office, door closed, a courtesy he usually reserved for bad news. He had the summary report open on his laptop and turned it toward me before he said anything. I want to be straight with you, he said. The migration came in about $180,000 over. I know that's not like you, but it's going to be part of the conversation when they decide on program lead, and I didn't want you hearing the number from someone else first. He said it gently, the way you'd tell someone about a diagnosis you hoped was a mistake. He even added that he'd argued for me anyway. I remember being grateful to him in that moment, before I'd had time to think it through. So when Greg's number landed at the review, $180,000 over, with my promotion attached to it as a casualty, the arithmetic simply didn't work. I'd frozen the project. I'd reconciled it 4 days before that conversation. There was no version of the ledger I hadn't already looked at. When the report finally came from finance, 11 days after I asked for it, I printed both documents and put them side by side on my desk, the way I do when a number won't sit still in my head. My tracker reconciled the Friday before close, on budget for $1,000 under, same cost center code as always. The official report, the same project, the same code, $178,400 over. Not close, not a rounding difference. 2 documents describing the same project as if they were describing 2 different projects entirely. I checked the code twice. It was mine. I checked the date range twice. It was the same quarter I'd already reconciled. Whatever had happened, it had happened inside numbers I'd already personally verified, which meant I hadn't missed something. It had happened after I'd already looked. I called Greg's assistant first, not Greg, because I wanted to understand the mechanics before I raised it with him directly. She was polite and useless in the specific way people are when they genuinely don't know something themselves. The report came from finance. She said she just forwarded it. That was fine. It meant I needed the source documents, not another summary. The gap wasn't spread evenly across the project, the way an honest overrun usually is. It was 4-line items, all clustered in the final 3 weeks before close, after my freeze was already in effect. For purchase orders, a vendor named Anchor Systems Group I had never contracted with for equipment categories that had nothing to do with a software migration, rack hardware, network appliances, and installation service fee. Dated June 14th, 17th, 22nd, and 25th. $61,200, $54,800, $38,900, $23,500. Together, $178,400 to the dollar, the exact size of my overrun. I hadn't requisitioned any of them. I didn't recognize the vendor, and I had frozen new spend against this code 3 weeks before the earliest of the 4 dates. I called our procurement contact to ask what Anchor Systems Group even was. She pulled up their vendor file while I waited, a hardware and networking supplier on our approved list for almost 2 years, mostly used by the infrastructure team for server room equipment. Not fraudulent, not fictitious, just completely unrelated to anything my project had ever needed, since we were migrating software onto systems that already existed. Someone had put 4 purchase orders on my project after I'd locked the door on it. Somebody had a key I didn't know about. A purchase order doesn't move on its own. Somebody requisitions it, and somebody approves it, and the system keeps a timestamp record of both. I pulled the approval chain on the first PO, expecting to find my own name buried somewhere. Some approval I'd forgotten. It wasn't there. The requisitioner was an administrative assistant in Greg's office. The approver was Greg. Above him, the sign-off went to the VP of Program Delivery, 2 levels above where I sat, neither of whom I'd ever once discussed equipment purchases with. All 4 POs followed the identical pattern. Requisition from Greg's office, approved by Greg, countersigned 2 levels up. My cost center code appeared exactly once on each document, as the line the charge would be billed to, not as an approver, not as a requisitioner, just as the destination. I clicked back and forth between the 4 records for a long time, as if the answer might change if I looked at it enough times. It didn't. Every timestamp was clean, every signature legitimate. Nothing about the paperwork itself was wrong. It just had nothing to do with me, except for the one line that made it my problem. I hadn't made a mistake on my own project. My project had been used as somewhere to put a number that belonged to someone else. A charge doesn't relocate itself from one cost center to another. Somewhere in the system, there had to be an entry that moved it, and entries like that come with a reason attached, even if the reason is buried in an email thread nobody expected anyone to reread. I asked finance to pull the journal history on the 4 charges, framing it as routine reconciliation follow-up rather than anything more, because I still wasn't certain what I was looking for. I found it in a journal entry log, a reallocation, dated the last day of the quarter, moving 4 charges off the operations cost center and onto mine. The finance system logs who initiates a reallocation, and this one traced back to Greg's assistant, acting, the notes field said per GM, then forwarded one link too far down an email chain that was never meant to reach me. I found the sentence that had authorized it. A vendor invoice thread, 6 replies deep, ending with a short note from Greg to his assistant. These can't sit on ops this quarter. Book them to the migration project. It has headroom. Signed with his initials, the way he signed everything internal. I read it 4 times before I let myself believe what it said. A miskeyed cost center code is an accident. A dated reallocation entry, backed by an email explaining exactly why my project was chosen, is a decision. He hadn't made an error. He had looked at my budget, seen that it had room, and used that room to make his own numbers disappear. I sat with that sentence for a long time. It has headroom meant he'd checked, which meant the real question wasn't whether this had happened to me. It was whether it had happened to anyone else with headroom too. Devin Cho ran the vendor consolidation project 2 floors down, and he'd always been the closest thing I had to a friend in the PMO. I caught him after a status meeting and asked, carefully, whether he'd ever eaten a charge at close that didn't belong to him. He didn't hesitate, which told me something before he'd even finished the sentence. $90,000, the same quarter, called a true-up on his final report. He'd been told the same thing I had. Over budget, not necessarily his fault, these things happen at close. And he'd let it go because pushing back on a number that small, that late, felt like more trouble than it was worth. I figured it was just how close works, he said. I didn't love it, but nobody fights 90 grand when they tell you it nets out fine. I asked if he still had the documentation. He did, because he was the same kind of person I was about a paper trail. When he pulled it up at his desk, the charges traced the same way mine had. Somebody else's spending reallocated at quarter end onto a project that had room to absorb it. Same close, same pattern, different amount. I wasn't imagining a pattern. I had company. That was worse in its way and steadier in another, because 2 people independently arriving at the same shape isn't a coincidence anymore. It's a method. Devin and I started comparing notes properly after that. Quietly, over coffee instead of email, because neither of us wanted a written trail that looked like we were building a case before we actually had one. He asked me once if I thought this was bigger than the 2 of us. I told him I didn't know yet, but I intended to find out. Nadia Voss and FP&A had access to something neither Devin nor I did. The full reallocation ledger for the division, not just our 2 projects. She didn't want to get pulled into anything without seeing it in writing first. So I brought her the timeline instead of the theory. She read it at her desk without saying much, then asked me to close her office door. She was quiet for a while, then she pulled up a full quarter of entries and walked me through them line by line, turning her monitor so I could follow along. Overspends lifted off Greg's own departmental cost centers, every close parked wherever a project happened to have headroom that month. Different projects each time. Same 2 approvers every time. I noticed the pattern back in March, she said, but a reallocation isn't evidence of anything by itself. I needed someone to bring me the other half. Each entry, on its own, could be explained as a normal close adjustment, a miscategorized vendor, a late reallocation, the ordinary mess of quarter-end accounting. That was the point. Any one of them would survive a casual look. It was only side by side, a whole quarter of them, that they stopped looking like accidents and started looking like a system for keeping one man's variance clean by spending other people's budgets. Nadia counted them out loud as she scrolled. 11 reallocations in a quarter, totaling just under $400,000, spread across 5 different projects so that no single one absorbed enough to raise a flag on its own. Mine had simply taken the largest share because mine had the most headroom. That was the sentence I needed, and once I had it, I understood why the department's numbers had looked so steady all year. They weren't steady. They were subsidized. I wanted Greg to be simply dishonest, because that would have been easier. What I found instead was a man under a target he hadn't set. Looking back, there had been a crack I'd dismissed months earlier. Greg had come out of a leadership offsite in the spring noticeably sharper, snapping at a scheduling question in a meeting where he was usually patient. I remember thinking he was just tired, the way everyone's tired in Q2. I hadn't thought to ask what had happened in that room, because it hadn't occurred to me yet that it had anything to do with me. Nadia told me the rest, the part that made it make sense without making it acceptable. The division had made departmental variance a non-negotiable number that year, tied directly to bonus payout and, quietly, to whether a director kept his department at all. Greg had missed the target once already, 2 years earlier, during a round of company-wide cost scrutiny, and had been told plainly in a follow-up meeting that a second miss wouldn't just cost him a bonus. Nadia had sat in on part of that meeting herself, taking notes for the department's financial file. That didn't make what he'd done to me a close adjustment. It made it a strategy, protect his own number by moving the miss on a whoever had room, quarter after quarter, and let these things happen at close cover for it every time someone noticed. Plenty of directors under the same pressure cut scope, or renegotiated a vendor contract, or took the hit on their own number and explained it upward honestly. Greg had chosen the version where somebody else absorbed the cost of his target instead. Understanding that didn't tell me to let it go. It told me where to actually aim, because Greg wasn't the only person whose decisions had made this rational. None of this meant anything as loose documents. It meant something as a timeline a stranger could follow without me in the room to narrate it. I spent 4 evenings building it, most of it at my kitchen table after my own kids were asleep, because I didn't want to build it anywhere Greg's office could see the screen. The 4 purchase orders in date order, the approval chain on each, the reallocation journal entry, the It Has Headroom email, Devin's true-up charge running alongside mine, and Nadia's summary of the wider quarter. I wrote it as a reconciliation, not an accusation, dates, amounts, document references, nothing editorialized. No adjectives, no conclusions. Just the sequence, in the order a stranger would need to see it to reach the same conclusion I had. I asked Nadia and Devin separately whether they'd be willing to be named in it if it went further than my own desk. Nadia said yes immediately, on the condition that her summary be attributed as analysis, not accusation. She wanted the numbers to speak, not her opinion of them. Devin took a day to think about it, then told me he was in, because he'd rather risk an awkward conversation with Greg than spend another close wondering whose budget was quietly absorbing his. Both of them saying yes told me something about how tired they'd already gotten of these things happen at close. But I owed Greg one thing before any of that, the chance to explain it to my face in case there was a version of this I hadn't seen yet. I asked Greg to meet, just the 2 of us at the end of the day when the floor was mostly empty. I brought the timeline but didn't lead with it. I told him what my tracker had shown before close and asked him to walk me through where the extra $178,000 had actually come from. His first answer was warm confusion. "That's not what I remember seeing," he said. "Let me check with finance and get back to you." When I mentioned the 4 purchase orders specifically, by number and date, his tone shifted to something more familiar, the voice he used in budget meetings. "Close is messy. Numbers move around at quarter end, you know that. Nobody actually lost $1. It all nets out for the company eventually. Then it should net out the same way on paper," I said, with my name off it. He didn't answer that directly. He said he'd look into who'd miscoded it. I put the email in front of him. "These can't sit on ops this quarter. Book them to the migration project. It has headroom." His initials underneath. He read it twice. I watched him decide, in real time, whether to keep denying it or not. Then a long silence, and finally, "That's just how we manage to the target." Not a denial, not an apology. A habit he'd stopped recognizing as a choice, said out loud, as though naming it that way made it reasonable. I asked him directly whether he understood that this had cost me a promotion. He said he hadn't thought about it that way, that from where he sat, it had just been math. I asked why my project specifically out of everyone's. He rubbed his face and said what I already half expected. Mine was the easiest to defend on paper because I never ran close to my own budget anyway. My discipline was the very thing that had made me convenient. He said it without any apparent sense of what that admission meant, and for a moment I almost felt sorry for how little he seemed to understand what he'd actually done. He assumed the conversation ended there, in his office, the way these conversations usually had before. I told him it didn't. I took the timeline to the divisional controller, someone who could read every entry in it without needing me to narrate a single line. That was the point of building it the way I had. She read it in front of me, asked 2 clarifying questions about dates, and told me she'd need a few weeks before she could tell me anything. Within 3 weeks, an internal audit opened on the quarter's reallocations across the department, not just my project. The auditors interviewed me twice, and once, briefly, Devin. They asked for the same things I'd already assembled: dates, amounts, document references, which was its own quiet confirmation that I'd built the file the right way the first time. My 4 charges and Devin's true-up were reattributed to the correct operations cost center, and my project showed on budget again, the way my tracker had said it was all along. My mid-year review was reopened, and the program lead decision along with it. A new control now requires the cost center owner's sign-off before any charge can be posted to their code, the exact gap Greg had used. Greg wasn't walked out. His conduct was named specifically in writing and tied to the division's own non-negotiable variance target, which got flagged the same week as part of what had made this rational in the first place. He kept his job. His numbers, for the first time in 2 years, are real. I heard, secondhand, that the variance policy itself is under review now, which is the part of this I actually care about. I felt relief, not triumph, when the correction went through. A director I trusted for 4 years was gone in every way that mattered, even though he still had the same title. That cost something. I let myself feel it instead of pretending I didn't. I'd spent 4 years believing his calm was reliability. It turned out some of it was just distance from his own numbers, the same distance he'd put between himself and mine. The program lead role came back around in the fall, and this time it was mine. My project sits on budget in the corrected books, exactly where my Friday tracker always said it would be. Devin reconciles his own numbers every week now too, the same habit I'd built out of pride and he'd built out of necessity. He told me once, half joking, that I'd turned him paranoid. I told him paranoid was just what careful looks like from the outside. Greg is still in the building, quieter, managing to a number that's finally honest. We still work near each other. The conversations are shorter now, and neither of us pretends they need to be anything more than professional. I don't know if I'll ever fully trust him again, and I've stopped needing to. What I keep isn't the audit finding. It's the corrected ledger page, the one that finally matches what I already knew the day I reconciled it. I keep it in the same drawer where I used to keep nothing at all, because for 11 years, I never thought I'd need proof that my own numbers were right. Now I know better. The numbers were never wrong. Someone had just decided, for 1 quarter, that they belonged to me instead of him. A clean report doesn't always mean a clean quarter. Sometimes it just means someone else absorbed the difference. Have you ever been blamed for a number that was never actually yours to carry? If workplace stories like this one feel familiar, you're welcome here, Coppernote.